Hey there everyone and welcome back to Afrodo Reviews. And on this channel, I help you decide. Is this book worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? That's what we're here to decide. Flint the King is a Dragonlance prequel novel published on May 1st, 1990 by author Mary L. Kirchhoff and Douglas Niles. It's a part of a series exploring what the various characters of the first Dragonlance series, the Dragonlance Chronicles, and what they did in the 5 years before they reconvened at their hometown of Solace and began the plot of the very first Dragonlance series. I couldn't find too much on the background of this specific book, other than to say, I think the copy I have is cursed. Well, the book gets cursed specifically for me. No joke. I had more trouble finishing this book than I have ever had in my life. And no, that's not a comment on how badly the book is written or anything. I mean, it would just things would happen to this book when I started to try and read it. Anytime I took this book to work with me, I'd have to clock in the second I get there due to a scramble. And we're talking, I arrive about 30 minutes early to work. So that's actually like, oh my god. Anytime I tried to read it at home, I got hit with tons of things that just had to be done before I could read it. Read it before going to work? Well, would you look at that? Something is always happening, like, oh, I only had 10 minutes to read it before I had to take off because my alarm clock didn't go off, or my dog suddenly decided that one walk she got 10 minutes ago isn't enough and she's gonna go right now unless I take her. Worst yet, I did have a physical copy of this book, and yet somehow in between a walk of between the clock out machine at my work and to my car, it vanished. I'm not exaggerating here. Like, no one has seen it. It was in one of my side pockets where it fit very comfortably, so it couldn't have just fallen out. And all of a sudden, it was just gone. So I had to go buy it on Amazon and download it for the Kindle since I didn't feel like waiting 2 weeks to get a new physical edition. And guess what? It really did not want to download on the Kindle. Anytime I hit the download and would not stare at it, something would interrupt it. 5 times that happened. And then I found the book literally right after I wrote this review. Where did I find it, you might ask? In a backpack I had at my house, which I hadn't used in weeks. This book is cursed. Anyways, here's the report card. Let's move on to the cover. Now, the cover I had of my physical book, and the one I'm choosing to review for this specific section, is this one. The cover features Flint, backed by 2 other dwarves as they face off against a horde of evil, almost zombie-looking dwarves, while a looming mountain fortress is in the background behind them. It's an okay cover. I mean, it does tell you that something about the book, that Flint is gonna have to muster his fellow dwarves to fight back against some damn dirty mountain dwarves. I'm sure the fortress behind them is meant to be Thorbidin, the mountain dwarf home, and this one mountain dwarf right there in the front is not wearing armor, which I can only assume is meant to be Pitrick, who is our main antagonist of the book. The problem I have with this cover is that it doesn't really represent the book very well despite having all these elements. Especially not in tone. Right off the bat, if you were to look at this cover, you would think the story is more like the Rowan plotline from the eldest book, where Flint Fireforge is either leading a defense of his home against mountain dwarves, or he's leading an attack against them. Pitrick is hard to pick out because all of his defining traits are adapted out in this art, as in the book, he's a very twisted, ugly hunchback of a character. And that actually does inform a great deal of his characterization. The 2 dwarfs on either side of Flint are just faceless dwarven soldiers, rather than being any of the dwarves that make an impact on the story. It's not the lady dwarf he works with, it's not Basalt, his nephew, it's not even how his siblings are described. If you saw this, you'd probably be expecting a book with a more serious tone, a book about war and fighting and defeating evil enemies. This is actually where I think Clyde Caldwell's cover for the book is a little better. Mind you, I still don't think it's perfect, but the art itself is much more reflective of the type of tone that the book is going for. The story is far more comedic than the previous cover would let on, and it also gives stronger hints to what Flint the King is actually like, while also hinting at parts of Flint's life only alluded to in the Dragonlance Chronicles. Now, I think it leans a little bit too much into the comedy aspect, which, again, isn't necessarily the main tone of the book. It's somewhere in the middle between comedy and serious action. But if I had to choose between the two, I would say this cover is far more representative of the book than the cover on the physical edition I had. But what's this book about, I hear you ask? Well, the Amazon profile, since I don't know what the physical copy is and I'm not going to chance my luck by going to look for it, would have you believe the peaceful life of Flint Fireforge is disturbed when he's forced to leave Solace and return to his dwarven homeland to investigate his brother's murder. As he delves into the mystery, unexpected allies and unseen enemies join the fight of truth against treachery. Flint soon discovers that to bring his brother's killer to justice, he must either die or become king. He's not sure which choice might be worse. And this cover is technically right. The cover of the book largely seems to have, in general, this entire cover of the book seems to largely have a tonal problem. Nothing in the synopsis is necessarily wrong. But if you were like me and you see the cover on the physical edition of the book and then read this synopsis, you're not gonna go into the book assuming that Flint becoming king is going to be largely comedic in nature. Because you're going to read that and think that Flint found out he has some lost ancestry where he literally has to become king of the hill dwarves and lead them in battle. But he really doesn't want to do that. That's what Clyde Caldwell's cover really shines much better, because if I were to read the synopsis and then see this cover, I think I would get the idea a little more that I'm supposed to be reading it. Flint must become king, or Flint must die trying, or become king. He's not sure which is worse. Still, I don't think the synopsis is great, but it definitely is a little better when combined with this cover. And I bring all this up because I think this is a perfect example of why I critique not only the cover, but the synopsis as part of my reviews on books. To showcase how much these things can influence your impressions of the book and how that can ultimately affect the viewing experience. If you go into this book expecting a genuinely, badass, fantastical fighting story about Flint the King, you're gonna be disappointed in the end, because that's not what the story's about. It's more of a middle ground comedic take between serious and purely comedic. I dived a little more into that with my last bookstore on Earth review, so let's talk about this book more in its entirety. So the real question is, what did I actually think of Flint the King as a story? I do think it's pretty bold of the authors to have confirmed that Flint Fireforge would have been at the January 6th insurrection.
Hey, yo, what the fuck?
Okay, so let me back up a bit. On a surface level, this book is fine. It's written in a way that reading it flows smoothly, and at no point did I feel there was an escalation of stakes that didn't quite match the current going on within the book. It also starts off pretty good by revealing that Flint Fireforge, unlike the rest of the companions of the main Chronicle series, didn't actually leave Solace when they all broke apart 5 years ago, only finding joy and adventure when it was with his friends. In fact, he intended to stay in Solace the entire time he was at home, peacefully, and is only drawn out of his house by the news of change in his old hometown of Hillhome. It's a nice reveal because I think it both fits Flint's character while also still allowing him to go on an adventure without it being out of character. I also like that Flint's solo journey is much more personal rather than something with grander stakes. Yes, it does have the overarching effect on the cultist plans that we'll see later on chronologically in the story, but all of Flint's concerns throughout this particular solo adventure are entirely personal. He's only worried about his family and his home, and he's not really motivated by much beyond that. In fact, you could almost say that it's a critique that Flint never comes to question what group needs weaponry so much that they're willing to make deals with dirty mountain dwarves? But I think the problems that I really had with this book feels like it should have been a story about Flint before he even met Tanis and the others, rather than a story that takes place in the 5 years between when all of the friends broke apart and when they would all come back together in Dragons of the Autumn Twilight. Largely because it doesn't really go well with the Flint's character in the Chronicles series when you put this one into context. Now, I think to talk about this, I'm obviously going to have to give a fair amount of spoilers. Mostly because I need to explain how the payoff to several of these plot threads are either wrong with their context or just don't pay off at all. Because of that, here's a quick 5-second spoiler warning. And now, let's move on. As I was saying, I feel this book should have been about Flint's adventure as a young man, rather than his adventures in the 5 years before meeting back up with Tanis. For example, if you might remember my first ever Dragonlance review on this channel, Dragons of Autumn Twilight, I mentioned one of the problems I had is that the book has a very uncomfortable way of dealing with the Gully Dwarf race that was introduced. Despite being, in my limited experience with the Dragonlance setting at the time, likened to Duragar, the Gully Dwarves themselves were largely harmless, dim-witted dwarves. So it was really weird to watch our supposed heroes not care about Raceland bewitching a group of them to mutually assure destruction against Raceland's enemies, along with the group's rather harsh comments on the Gully Dwarves themselves when they haven't done anything to earn such ire to us. It felt like a group of inexperienced, simple dwarves being hated on for no reason, with the sole exception of Flint Fireforge, who gave an actual reason to despise Gully Dwarves. He reveals that he had been enslaved by them for 3 of the 5 years he was apart from the group, which in theory is what this book was supposed to be about. Except, having read this book, the context of that line is now Flint actually comes out of that scene looking like the worst of the group. Because while the Gully Dwarves do kidnap him, they by and large prove over and over to Flint that they are good people. They only kidnap him and enslave him because they had a prophecy that he would descend down from the heavens with his queen and lead the Gully Dwarves into an era of peace. And so were very reluctant to allow him to leave because he had fulfilled all the prerequisites for that prophecy. But putting aside the kidnapping, they feed him, effectively worship him, and when he does embrace the idea of being king, thus he's not sure which is worse because it's being king of the Gully Dwarves in the synopsis, they even march to war for him and save his hometown and family. Flint in this book mourns over the death of a Gully Dwarf he got to know throughout the book because he's genuinely upset by that Gully Dwarf's death. So effectively, Flint Fireforge has a deep-seated hatred of Gully Dwarves. They made him their king, and he died in his honor. You see how that doesn't make sense when you put that into the context of the line of Flint Fireforge angrily saying, "They enslaved me for 3 years, that's why I hate Gully Dwarves so much."
Only one thing I hate more than a gully dwarf, and that's a goblet.
But this contributes to another issue altogether. You see, my opening line of the refuge section wasn't just there to keep you watching. It actually contributes to something I felt throughout the entirety of this story. And that was that Flint Fireforge, and rather the story in its entirety, could be summed up as an old man finds out that his hometown is doing business with foreigners he hates, so he goes to put a stop to it. The comment of him investigating his brother's death is technically true, but that's only after Flint Fireforge returns to his hometown. He doesn't go back to Hillhome for that reason. He goes back to Hillhome because a dwarf passing through Solace tells him that mountain dwarves have brought in a ton of business to Hillhome. And Flint Fireforge thinks that's weird because, in his own words, no self-respecting hill dwarf would ever trust a mountain dwarf.
It's in your blood. That's racist. Your soul. That's racist. Your eyes. That's gay.
This book forced me to kind of step back and remind myself this is an older fantasy work. And sometimes, as much as we mocked it when it came out, and I stand by that it's really fucking stupid, people like Extra Credits did have something of a point when they said that racism in a fantasy novel can be directly linked to real world racism. Flint is never called out for his racism against the Mountain Dwarves. In fact, his racism is validated at the end because the Mountain Dwarves were in fact smuggling weapons through Hillhome and did in fact murder his brother. And even the more good-natured Gully Dwarves are still largely mocked, even if we do get more humanizing scenes with them. At the end of the day, the only hill dwarves that were accepting of these dirty dwarves were dwarves that personally benefited. So I had to remind myself, this book does take place. This book was written much, much before I was born, basically. So I have to put aside some of my standards, modern day standards, and just accept this was the thing at the time. Then again, Flint Fireforge in one scene does call a group of Gully dwarves, which are dark-skinned dwarves, tunnel apes. So, yeah. Maybe not. At first, I thought the story was going to prove my fears wrong when it introduces a character named Piran, who is one of the Mountain Dwarf guard captains. And I thought, oh, okay, so we are going to see a good side to the Mountain Dwarf society, as Piran is not only an honorable woman, but is running afoul of the more unsavory parts of her people's society as well. She is a Mountain Dwarf, but she's a good person. She's of a high rank, which means she's valued in her society, and maybe she's more reflective of the general Mountain Dwarf society rather than the society that is corrupted and dark, right? Now, turns out that she's actually half Hill Dwarf, which explains why she's so good, again, in the book's own words. And when push comes to shove, literally, she easily defects over to the Hill Dwarf side and kills all of her former subordinates with little to no thought in either direction. Speaking of Piran, she also represents both the old and new issues I've had with the Dragonlance books. Namely, she's also given an insta-love romance with Flint Fireforge. Just like all the other ones I talk about, basically within days of meeting this man, she's not only in love with him, but she's trying to act like a domestic housewife, despite being introduced as a gruff, no-nonsense warrior woman. Major downgrade in my opinion, but whatever. But this steers into my problem with the fact that this should have been a story that occurred before Flint met Tannis. Because, well, Piran is not in Chronicles, and Flint never mentions her. So when Flint finally gives up the fight because we're just from two different walks of life, we can never be together, plus an implied massive age gap, you know she has to die. Flint is going to die in less than 5 years from when this story takes place anyways, because he has a heart attack and dies in Dragons of the Spring Dawning. So not only is Piran's death super obvious, but it's the only route it could go, which makes it ultimately very unsatisfying when it does happen. Not only does Piran make a terrible decision at the final moment, choosing to venture into Hillhome after the defense of the town crumbled to find a couple of her soldiers, knowing full well that the powerful, magical, obsessed Pitrick is after her in specific, but she does so alone, despite being able to take others with her. So really, is it any shock when she's gravely wounded and dies in Flint's arm at the end of the book?
This is quite a shock. On the other hand, it's not surprising in the least.
And apart from that, there's more than a few issues with the books here and there. For one, there's flat out just plot holes in this book. For example, in this book, Flint gets a hold of an old axe that he and his brother once had, and he had lost during their adventures, called the Tharkin axe. He had lost it while adventuring with his brother, and by fluke of fate, it comes back into his hand. So Flint, wielding this ancient, powerful axe, whose inscription he doesn't know how to read, interesting, defends his home from mountain dwarves. He's in battle with mountain dwarves, slaying mountain dwarves with this axe. Eventually, he kills the enemy commander, a mountain dwarf named Pitrick, with the axe. Pitrick, of course, being a mountain dwarf. It turns out that the axe is actually specifically enchanted so that if a dwarf were to use it to spill the blood of another dwarf, it would lose its power. So why did it only lose its power when he killed Pitrick? There's a reason I emphasize so much that Flint has been killing dwarves all night with the axe. The axe should have lost its power at the beginning of this battle, not at the end when he kills Pitrick. Why was it Pitrick's death, the most deserving of all the deaths, the one where Flint seemingly crossed the line in the enchantment's eyes? It doesn't make any sense. Also, furthermore, it doesn't have any narrative cohesion with the story at large. Again, this is another one of those, this only exists because Flint didn't have the Tharkan axe during the Chronicles series. So I had to get rid of it by the end of this book, despite the fact I wanted to give it to him. Obviously, he has to lose this axe. But instead of doing something like passing down his legacy to Basalt, his nephew, with the axe to honor his dead brother, and Basalt's fallen father, to explain why he no longer has the axe on him, while also opening the doors for Basalt to do adventures, the choice was instead made to attach this very strange prophecy that should have been tripped 10 times over by the time it finally is tripped. But back to narrative cohesion. This enchantment would have made sense if the story was trying to show that the dwarves were needlessly hateful of each other, and if one had to make the axe lose its power, it should have occurred when Pitrick used the axe and killed Pirit, thus subsequently leaving him defenseless when Flint attacks him in rage, while also furthering the theme that Pitrick is the sole source, not the sole source, but Pitrick's a rotten element in dwarven society that keeps their races from actually making peace with each other for the sake of his own benefit, showing that their racism against each other is largely unfounded and they need to make peace. But that's not what it is. It's, for some reason, Pitrick, above all the other dwarves that Flint killed that night, counts more as a dwarf than any of them, so he doesn't have the axe anymore. I think another issue I had with this book is the Fireforge family is very heavily undercharacterized. Now, this was probably always going to be a problem, admittedly, as Flint has double digits in brothers and sisters, which means if they have kids, obviously there's not going to be enough time to anywhere near explore the amount of them. But there's at least needed to be some strong connection with his nephew Basalt. Not only was Basalt and him basically like best friends, according to this book, when the lad was young, and Flint did live in Hillholm, but with the death of Basalt's father, the novel almost seems to have poised Flint to step up and fill the role of a father figure. Except no, Basalt is only a side character, with most of Flint's other family not even that. There's one point in the book where Flint's brothers are killed right in front of him. One of Flint's brothers is killed right in front of him, and the scene doesn't have any emotion in this. I didn't know this brother. Flint didn't seem too broken up about it, and it doesn't affect anything story-wise, so it's just a death to be there. And yet it still sort of expects you to mourn the dwarf by the sole fact that he was Flint's brother. At the end of the day, this book was a really disappointing read for what it was supposed to be a prequel to my favorite character of the original Dragonlance Chronicles. And I'm forced to give it a mere 5 out of 10. So this one hurts to give because, well, largely, I think the main reason I read this book was because of Flint the Dwarf being my favorite character in the Dragonlance books. So it makes it all the worse when I can say, yeah, I don't recommend reading this book to anyone. Well, even though it's largely inoffensive if you separate yourself from the fact that it's about a very racist guy going home to stop foreigners from being in his home, and it's not even written objectively terrible, there's just really not anything of substance to read in this book. The story gets rid of all its meaningful developments to Flint's character because he didn't have them in Dragons of the Autumn Twilight, which has the unfortunate problem of making you ask, well, then what's the point of reading this book? Nothing about it has any meaningful consequences. It outright violates the canon provided within Flint's supposed enslavement by the Gully Dwarves by turning it into something way less awful, which in turn makes Flint come off as way less sympathetic in the scenes with the Gully Dwarves in the original book. And none of this informs any of the aspects of Flint's character. Even the death of Pirin doesn't strike a chord with me between that and maybe his fearful desire of losing one of his friends. That's just something Flint has always had. I know I haven't done this in a while, but I honestly think this book deserves Mount Doom because even though it's a 5 out of 10, it's such a nothing book, I genuinely don't think there's any benefit to reading it. It's like just running in place for 2 hours before you just go run along the path. And at worst, it actually makes the reading experience of the book it's a prequel to worse. So yeah. That being said, just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having, even the bad ones. See you later, everyone.